Welcome to today's historical deep dive, where we unpack the minds and moments that shaped our world. Sometimes, history isn't just dates and names. It's a fever dream of power, a chess game played with nations, a cautionary tale whispered across centuries. Today, we step into one such dream, one woven by a man who believed he could reshape reality with sheer will. If you love immersive, real storytelling about ambition and downfall, hit like and subscribe. It helps us more than you know. Drop a comment with your favorite Napoleon quote or the moment that shocked you most. Let's begin and change the way you think about history. You stand on a rise near Kovno in the late spring of 1812. The air vibrates, not with birdsong, but with the low hum of 200,000 men. Dust rises in plumes from countless marching feet, stretching back as far as the eye can see, a human tide swelling towards the river Niemen, the border with Russia. This is the Grande Armée, the largest force Europe has ever assembled, a kaleidoscope of uniforms and languages: French, Italian, German, Polish, Dutch, bound together by one man's will. You see the wagons laden with supplies, the vast cavalry squadrons, the endless lines of infantry, the glint of bayonets under the pale sun. It is magnificent, terrifying, an expression of power on a scale previously unimaginable. And there, at the head, is Napoleon. He surveys this instrument of his will, his face a mask of determination, perhaps tinged with an almost religious fervor. He has conquered Europe, humbled emperors, redrawn maps. Now, only the vast, enigmatic East remains outside his absolute control. His ambition, honed by a decade of improbable victories, has reached its fever pitch. It tells him no obstacle is too great, no distance too far, no enemy too resilient. This moment, on the edge of the unknown, is the physical manifestation of ultimate ambition, poised to challenge the very limits of geography and human endurance. Yet, beneath the surface, whispers of doubt ripple through the ranks. The sheer scale feels unnatural, the objective vague, the warnings from seasoned generals dismissed. It is a scene of breathtaking power, yes, but also one heavy with the unspoken tension of a venture pushed beyond the boundaries of rational calculation, propelled by an ego that has become indistinguishable from destiny itself. Here, Napoleon makes the ultimate gamble, a decision rooted not in strategic necessity. Russia had valid grievances, the continental system was failing, but in a profound, almost divine sense of self-belief. He must compel the Tsar, must extend his dominion, because the alternative feels like retreat, a concession his ego cannot afford. This isn't just a campaign, it's a coronation march into the infinite, a test of whether human will can bend reality itself. The surprising detail: despite his meticulous planning in other campaigns, the logistics for this invasion were notoriously shaky from the start, plagued by corruption, poor roads, and an underestimation of the distances involved, a stark contrast to the myth of the flawless administrator. It reveals a disconnect between the grand vision and the gritty details, perhaps already clouded by overconfidence. Ask yourself, is this the face of a visionary general, or the face of a man utterly consumed by the illusion of his own invincibility? What would it take for you to stake everything, absolutely everything, on a single monumental roll of the dice? The dust motes dance in the sunlight, each particle a testament to a million stories marching towards an unknown fate, driven by the blind ambition of one extraordinary, terrifying man. You stand on the battlements of history, watching the whirlwind of Napoleon's rise. You remember the impossible marches, the audacity at Lodi Bridge, where you defied cannon fire, the tenacity at Arcola, fighting through swamps, the strategic brilliance at Austerlitz, shattering the combined might of empires. Each victory wasn't just a conquest of land, it was a conquest of perception, for the world, and crucially, for himself. These early campaigns weren't merely military triumphs. They were psychological breakthroughs. They taught Napoleon that convention was a cage for lesser minds, that speed and surprise could dismantle armies twice your size, that immense risks faced with unshakable will often yielded immense rewards. The legend wasn't just born on the battlefield. It was forged in the crucible of overcoming what everyone else deemed impossible. And as the cheers grew louder, as kings bowed and maps were redrawn, a potent elixir began to saturate his soul. The dangerous brew of unchecked success. It whispers of infallibility. It dulls the sharp edges of caution. It breeds a subtle contempt for the very rules and realities you so brilliantly overcame. The man who meticulously planned every skirmish begins to trust instinct over intelligence, audacity over logistics, the sheer weight of his will over the stubborn laws of physics or politics. This is the profound, often overlooked insight. Past achievements, while building essential confidence, carry a hidden poison. They can blind a leader to evolving realities, inflate self-belief into delusion, and set the stage not just for a setback, but for a spectacular, gravity-defying fall. The very confidence needed to win becomes the source of vulnerability. It's the tragic irony of the champion who, having proven he can fly, forgets that the ground still exists. You watch him, scaling ever higher peaks, and you have to ask yourself the chilling question: was this escalating brilliance or creeping hubris? What would you have done, feeling the world bending to your will, standing on the summit of so many impossible victories? Would you still see the cliffs ahead, or only the boundless sky you believed you now commanded? The foundation of future failures is often laid stone by stone with the building blocks of past successes. Napoleon sits hunched over maps in the opulent chill of the Tuileries. Lamplight glints off polished surfaces, but his eyes, narrowed and intense, are fixed on the sprawling, unfamiliar lines of Eastern Europe. Advisors murmur, ghosts in the periphery of his focus. The strategic goal is clear, burning in his mind: force Tsar Alexander I to abide by the continental system. This isn't just economics, it's personal. Russia trades with Great Britain, Napoleon's eternal nemesis. It's a crack, a betrayal, a gaping wound in the edifice of his continental dominance, built brick by bloody brick across a decade. He sees it as the last holdout, the final piece needed to truly cripple perfidious Albion. The scene is one of relentless energy. Rapid-fire questions cut through the air, swift decisions are scrawled onto paper, plans are set in motion with the terrifying precision of a coiled spring. You see the emperor at the height of his administrative power, a dynamo of will. Yet, underlying this formidable display of leadership, there's a strategic flaw, vast and unseen by the emperor himself, perhaps the greatest of his career. It is the belief that a military solution, the Grand Army, the tool that has carved his empire, could solve what was fundamentally an economic and political problem with a vast, decentralized opponent. Russia is not Austria, not Prussia, not even Spain. It is distance. It is weather. It is a different kind of foe, resistant to the quick, decisive blows that defined his earlier triumphs. This reveals a critical leadership insight. Grand strategic objectives, no matter how ambitious, must align with the practical realities and nature of the opponent. A hammer is useless if the problem is liquid. You can't conquer geography with cavalry. And here lies a moment of potent, tragic irony. Napoleon, the master strategist, the architect of Austerlitz and Jena, is about to commit his most significant strategic error by seeing the Russian challenge not as it was, but as a problem solvable by the method he knew best. He is the ultimate craftsman, holding only a hammer, and suddenly every problem looks suspiciously like a nail. You watch him, confident and decisive, walking towards the precipice, convinced his strength will overcome all. Ask yourself, is your solution dictated by the problem at hand, or merely the favorite tool in your arsenal? Beware the leader, or even yourself, who sees every challenge as a nail because they only possess a hammer. The chess master must understand not just how to move his pieces, but the nature of the board, the unique weaknesses of his specific opponent in this specific game. Napoleon, here in the Tuileries, seems to forget this fundamental rule. Blinded by the singular glare of his favorite weapon. Picture the scene not on the map, where armies are just colored pins marching across grand territories, but in the logistical camps churning behind the advancing columns. You step into the organized chaos, and it immediately feels wrong. Quartermasters, men who normally embody order and efficiency, are tearing their hair out. They clutch crumpled manifests like desperate prayers, faces etched with the impossible math of feeding 500,000 men. Generals aren't strategizing flanking maneuvers. They're arguing, voices raw with frustration, over supply lines stretched thinner than spun glass across unforgiving plains. Reports pour in, a chilling litany of failure. Wagons breaking down on roads that barely exist. Forage for tens of thousands of horses vanishing into the vastness, leaving the cavalry, the pride of the Grande Armée, dependent on luck and desperate foraging. The sheer, mundane impossibility of feeding, equipping, and transporting this human tide across undeveloped territories shouts from every dispatch, every exhausted face. The practicality of the invasion wasn't just a challenge, it was a nightmare, a monstrous reality, systematically ignored for the sake of the grand vision unfolding in Napoleon's mind. Here lies the harsh, undeniable insight, delivered not by a general, but by a starving horse or a soldier shivering in threadbare uniform. Vision and charisma can indeed mobilize men and resources on an unprecedented scale. They can make armies march through impossible heat or blinding snow. But they cannot conjure grain from empty fields or shorten endless, hostile distances. They cannot magic boots onto blistered feet or medicine into cholera-ridden camps. Ignoring these brutal, logistical realities wasn't audacious. It was, in chilling retrospect, suicidal. It's tempting to see Napoleon's drive as pure, unadulterated ambition, blind to limits. But the deeper insight is perhaps more tragic. He knew logistics. He was a master organizer in his earlier campaigns. Yet somewhere along the path of relentless victory, the belief in his destiny, his absolute conviction in his ability to bend reality to his will, allowed him to dismiss these fundamental constraints. He believed his presence, his genius on the battlefield, could overcome any deficit. The tragic irony? The battle would never truly be joined on equal terms because the army would be starving and freezing before it ever reached the decisive point. The reflection is stark. A cold gust of wind blowing through the logistical camps. No matter how inspiring your goal, how brilliant your strategy, neglect the mundane, unglamorous details of execution at your absolute peril. The greatest dreams, the most ambitious conquests, are built not just on inspiring ideas that move men's souls, but on the unglamorous, meticulous foundation of supply chains, resource management, and practical foresight. Ask yourself, where in your own grand plans might you be ignoring the quartermasters, the supply lines, the basic, brutal math of reality? What would you have done standing there in Napoleon's boots, receiving those dire reports? Would you have listened to the desperate pleas of the men dealing with the practical earth? Or would the dazzling vision of Moscow still have shone too brightly to see the fatal cracks appearing in the foundation? The answer, etched in the snows of Russia, is a universal lesson in the limits of ambition without execution. June 24th, 1812. You are one of the soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder on the temporary pontoon bridges spanning the Niemen River. The air is thick with the smell of sweating men, horses, and the damp wood of the bridges. There's a palpable mix of excitement and apprehension in the ranks. Ahead lies Russia, a land of myth and distance, a vast, unknown quantity that seems to swallow horizons. This isn't just another campaign. It feels different, bigger. As you step onto the bridge, the planks creak underfoot, a low groan echoed by thousands of similar groans all along the miles of hastily constructed crossings. The river flows below, a gray, indifferent witness. Looking back, the shore you just left already feels miles away, psychologically, if not physically. There is no turning back now. You are committed, part of an immense, unprecedented wave surging eastward. Napoleon, perhaps observing from a nearby height, has made his move. This crossing of the Niemen is not merely a tactical deployment, it's a profound psychological and historical threshold. Like Caesar crossing the Rubicon, this act is irreversible. The die is cast on a scale the world has never seen. An army of over 500,000 men, a kaleidoscope of nations under one eagle banner, stepping into the unknown. The insight here is stark and simple, yet often missed in the rush of ambition. Some decisions are truly irreversible. Once that first step is taken across the threshold, whether it's a river, a declaration of war, a binding contract, or a personal commitment, the possibilities narrow dramatically. The consequences, good or bad, are set in motion along a path that becomes harder and harder to deviate from. Napoleon believed he was forcing the Tsar to terms, pushing the irresistible force against the immovable object. He saw the crossing as the essential pressure point. What he perhaps underestimated was the vastness of the object he intended to move, and the way it could simply absorb his force, drawing it deeper into a trap of distance, climate, and logistical collapse. There's a tragic irony here, a cruel twist of fate, visible only in hindsight. Every confident stride across that creaking bridge in the summer heat of 1812 leads inexorably to the frozen, desperate retreat that would shatter the Grande Armée and mark the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. The ambition that propelled this monumental undertaking contained the seeds of its own destruction, a gamble so vast it risked everything. This moment forces a brutal reflection. In leadership and in life, can you recognize the true points of no return? Are you crossing deliberately with a full, chilling understanding of the finality involved, the narrowing of options, and the potential monumental consequences? Or are you drifting over thresholds, unaware until the far bank is your only option, your fate sealed by 100 small, unexamined steps? The Niemen crossing wasn't just a logistical marvel. It was a moment of ultimate, irreversible commitment, a historical monument to the danger of believing success makes you immune to consequence. Ask yourself, in your own pursuits, are you mindful of the rivers you are crossing? The dust rises around your boots, thick and relentless, coating everything in a fine gray film. Weeks have blurred into months under the relentless Russian sun. Then the creeping chill of autumn. You march through villages, not to cheers or resistance, but to an eerie, absolute silence. Sometimes, smoke still curls from roofs deliberately set ablaze. The wells, you discover, are poisoned, the fields around them scorched, the crops long gone. Your soldiers find only emptiness where they expected sustenance, refuge, a place to rest their weary bones. This is not the war you envisioned. You, Napoleon, master of swift maneuver and decisive battle, expected the enemy to stand and fight, to offer a shoulder you could break against. Instead, they melt away like snow in spring, drawing you deeper, ever deeper, into this immense, indifferent land. Their strategy is not to defeat your army in battle, but to starve it, to exhaust it, to let the sheer scale of Russia consume you. It is a strategy of absence, of denial, a void that swallows your plans and your resources alike. The initial optimism, the grand pronouncements of bringing swift victory, curdles into a bitter frustration. The vastness itself seems to be your opponent, stretching endlessly before you, offering no point of attack, only retreat. Your greatest strengths, speed, concentration of force, the hunger for a climactic confrontation, are rendered useless against an enemy who refuses to engage on your terms. It's like wielding a hammer against fog. There's a brutal irony in this. The man who conquered nations with overwhelming presence is being defeated by utter absence. The invincible Grande Armée is being bled dry by hunger and the gnawing psychological toll of marching through desolation. This deliberate scorched earth policy, employed by commanders like Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, was a profound miscalculation on your part, a failure to understand an opponent willing to sacrifice their own land to deny you victory. It wasn't cowardice, it was a grim, strategic patience you simply couldn't comprehend from the palaces of Paris. The insight here is stark. Are you so fixated on the battle you want to fight that you fail to see the one you're actually in? Is your brilliant, perfected plan becoming obsolete with every step, every abandoned village, every poisoned stream? Adaptability isn't just a tactical advantage. In this landscape, facing this ghost of an enemy, it becomes the only path to survival. You continue the march, perhaps unwilling or unable to admit that the very ground beneath your feet is fighting against you. Ask yourself, watching the smoke rise from another empty village, is this unwavering resolve or catastrophic blindness? What would you have done standing there, feeling the emptiness echo in your own ambitious soul? The fields offer no harvest, the enemy no battle, only the endless horizon, pulling you towards a fate you refuse to see coming. The ancient walls of Smolensk loom, then crack under the ceaseless French artillery. You order the assault, a churning wave of exhausted, dust-caked men against a desperate Russian defense. This is not Austerlitz's elegant maneuver. This is a grinder, a slugfest in the rubble. Smoke billows from the city, a pyre engulfing houses, churches, history itself. You watch from a distance as the fighting devolves into brutal, street-by-street combat. Men bayoneting each other in burning alleys. It takes days. The cost is staggering. Thousands of your soldiers fall, their bodies mingling with Russian dead in the smoldering ruins. You win. You take the city, but the moment you step through the breached walls, you taste the ashes of victory. Smolensk is a charnel house, the ghost town, still spitting embers. It offers no supplies, no rest, no strategic advantage save a ruined position on the road east. And the Russians, they have retreated again, slipping away like smoke before you could pin them down for the decisive battle you craved. The main army, battered but intact, is still out there, luring you deeper into this vast, unforgiving land. This isn't just a costly win, it's the bitterest kind. It's the textbook definition of a Pyrrhic victory, a triumph bought at such ruinous expense it leaves you weaker than if you had lost, particularly when your primary objective remains utterly unfulfilled. You claimed the battlefield, but lost the strategic moment. You captured a ruin, and the true prize, the enemy's fighting force, simply evaporated ahead of you. There's a subtle, chilling irony here. The act of securing Smolensk became less about conquering a city and more about chasing a phantom, expending precious life and dwindling resources on a burnt-out husk, while the true adversary dictates the terms by refusing to fight. This moment at Smolensk is a brutal lesson in the difference between winning a battle and winning a war. Every step eastward costs you men, horses, supplies, and time, trading irreplaceable resources for ground that yields nothing but deeper entanglement. The Russian strategy of denial, retreating, burning, and stretching your supply lines is succeeding precisely because you are compelled to follow, forced to engage in these draining, localized fights that bleed your army dry without landing a decisive blow against the enemy's core strength. You are winning the tactical skirmishes, yes, but losing the strategic campaign. Ask yourself, in your own ambitions, in your own pursuits, are you sometimes celebrating costly wins that feel like progress, securing a difficult client, completing a grueling project, but drain your resources, exhaust your team, and leave the main challenge, the ultimate goal, untouched or even further away? True strategic thinking measures impact, not just activity. It's about securing the objective, not just winning intermediate skirmishes, especially when those skirmishes exact such a heavy price. At Smolensk, you secured a ruin and paid in blood, while the enemy slipped further into the strategic depths of Russia, leaving you alone with the ashes and the chilling silence. Inside a temporary headquarters, the air is thick with the scent of stale coffee, wood smoke, and the unspoken dread of men pushed past their limit. Maps, creased and stained with sweat and spills, are spread across a rough table. You stand there, boots caked with mud, listening impatiently to the dispatches. The words are bleak. Dwindling supplies, horses dying in droves, men succumbing to sickness and exhaustion, not from battle, but from the relentless march itself. Your generals, their faces etched with concern, present their case. Their voices are measured, but the urgency is winter is coming, a white, silent enemy more formidable than any army. Wait for spring. But Moscow. Moscow is calling. It feels so close now, just a few weeks' march away. You see it in your mind, the ancient capital, the heart of Russia. Surely, taking the Tsar's sacred city will break his will, force him to the negotiating table. The sheer psychological blow, you reason, will be enough. All this suffering, all this distance covered, it cannot be for nothing. To stop now feels like admitting defeat, like folding a hand when the river card is just about to be dealt. You look at the weary faces of your most trusted commanders, but you see only hesitation where you need resolve. This is the moment the poker player pushes all his chips into the center. The general who orders one last charge into the teeth of the storm. The logic of the initial plan has fractured under the weight of reality, yet the pull of the objective remains absolute. You believe, with a fervor that borders on desperation, that the next step, just one more, will solve everything. Taking Moscow will magically replenish supplies, restore the health of the army, and melt the Tsar's defiance. It is hope dressed up as strategy, pride whispering seductive lies. You make the decision. Push on. The order is given, carrying the force of destiny. What the generals see as reckless folly, you see as necessary courage. The final, old stroke that must succeed because the alternative, admitting the campaign is failing, is unthinkable. This decision captures the leader doubling down on a failing strategy, not because the path ahead is clear or logical, but because turning back feels like a betrayal of every sacrifice made thus far. This isn't resolve. It is stubbornness, fueled by the powerful, misleading force of sunk costs. You've invested too much blood, too much treasure, too much of your own formidable will to walk away. Ask yourself, standing in that temporary headquarters, feeling the weight of an empire and an army on your shoulders, with the reports of ruin stacking up, what would you have done? Would you have recognized the trap of sunk costs, the dangerous illusion that the money, time, or effort already spent justifies spending more? Or would you, like Napoleon, have confused the refusal to surrender with the wisdom of pressing forward, believing that the grand prize just over the horizon would somehow validate the escalating catastrophe? It's a mark of strength to know when to revise the plan, when to cut your losses, not when to mindlessly push on because you've invested too much to admit you might be wrong. And as you give the order, a chilling irony hangs in the air. The city you seek as salvation will become the grave of your grandest ambition. September 7th, 1812. The field of Borodino is a crucible where ambition is measured in blood and shattered bone. You stand near the emperor, watching the dawn break over a landscape that will soon resemble hell. The air vibrates with the incessant thunder of artillery, thousands of cannons roaring simultaneously, tearing holes in the fabric of reality. Smoke hangs thick and acrid, a suffocating shroud over the desperate dance of infantry squares and cavalry charges. You see the human waves crash against entrenched positions, then recoil, leaving behind tangled heaps of bodies. The ground becomes slick, not with morning dew, but with a gruesome mix of mud, blood, and viscera. The screams are constant, a morbid symphony beneath the deafening roar of the guns. 40 French generals fall dead or wounded this day. Over 70,000 men, your soldiers, their soldiers, men from every corner of Europe caught in this maelstrom, cease to breathe between sunrise and sunset. It is a human harvest on an unimaginable scale. Napoleon achieves his objective. The Russians withdraw, abandoning the field. It is a tactical victory, the ground held at horrific cost. Yet as the cannons fall silent and the smoke begins to clear, a new sound emerges, more chilling than the battle itself. The groans of tens of thousands of wounded men, a low, guttural symphony of suffering stretching across the vast field. The Russian army, though battered, is not annihilated. They retreat in order, preserving their strength, luring you deeper into the vast, unforgiving Russian interior. Here, at Borodino, you confront a brutal truth. Your unparalleled tactical genius, the mind that conjured Austerlitz and Jena, finds its limits. Faced with an enemy willing to absorb catastrophic losses, possessing immense reserves of manpower and the strategic depth of a continent, even the most brilliant maneuvers yield only Pyrrhic gains. Numbers matter. Willpower matters. The cold, hard arithmetic of attrition begins to eclipse the dazzling geometry of tactics. A surprising detail often overlooked. Some reports claim Napoleon suffered from a severe cold and fever on the day, potentially affecting his famous energy and decision-making, perhaps contributing to his hesitation to commit the final, decisive reserve of the Imperial Guard. This bloody stalemate serves as a stark illustration. The price of holding this particular field is astronomical, leaving your army depleted and vulnerable for the challenges ahead. The objective was Moscow. The cost was 70,000 souls. Ask yourself, what is the true human cost of your grandest ambitions and strategies? Are you prepared to pay it, personally, and through the lives of others? And is the objective truly, undeniably worth such a price? Sometimes, perhaps, the greatest victories are the ones you choose not to fight, the lines you refuse to cross. But here, at Borodino, that choice was not made. The harvest was gathered. Mid-September 1812. You march into Moscow. After weeks of relentless advance, through dust, heat, and bloody fields like Borodino, the golden domes shimmer on the horizon, the ancient heart of Russia. This is the prize. This is the symbol of ultimate victory. But as your army enters the vast city, a strange silence falls. It is eerily quiet. The grand buildings stand empty, their windows dark eyes staring out at the conqueror. The population has vanished. It feels like entering a ghost town, a beautiful, opulent stage stripped bare of its actors. You expected cheers, perhaps defiant glares, certainly people. Instead, there is only absence. Then the smoke begins. Not the dust kicked up by marching feet, but thin plumes rising from distant quarters. It spreads quickly, deliberately, like a poison seeping through the veins of the city. These are no accidents. They are strategic fires, ignited by the retreating Russians, ordered by Governor Rostopchin. Moscow is becoming an inferno. The wooden city, the very symbol you sought to capture, is being consumed by flames. Napoleon takes up residence in the Kremlin, the ancient citadel, surrounded by a sea of fire. From its walls, you watch as your grandest conquest burns around you, a crown of fire you never intended to wear. This scene is steeped in tragic irony, sharp as a bayonet thrust. You have achieved your symbolic objective. You have captured the enemy's capital. But the grand prize, the city itself, offers no strategic advantage now. Its logistical value is destroyed. Its political value evacuated. It is a shell, and now that shell is a death trap, a burning cage built of your own ambition. This moment whispers a profound, brutal insight. Achieving the stated goal doesn't guarantee success if the goal itself was flawed from the start, or if the enemy's actions render it valueless. Victory can be the cruelest illusion. You hold the empty golden cup, but it is filled with ash and fire. This was not just bad luck. It was a consequence of misunderstanding your enemy and the true nature of the war. Russia wasn't fighting for Moscow. They were fighting for survival, willing to sacrifice their most sacred spaces to deny you the means to continue. Napoleon, the master strategist of pitched battles and swift victories, found himself ensnared by an enemy who refused to play by his rules, an enemy who burned their own capital to deny him respite. It is a chilling lesson in the limits of power when confronted by absolute desperation and a willingness to endure total loss. Ask yourself, was this the inevitable outcome of overreach or a unique betrayal by circumstances? What would you have done? Standing amidst the flames in the Kremlin, the prize won, but utterly lost. The conquest of Moscow offers no rest, no supplies, only a burning monument to a hollow triumph. The ashes still hang in the air, thick and acrid, a constant reminder of a victory that feels suspiciously like defeat. Weeks bleed into months in the shell of Moscow. You pace through the ruined palaces, the city, a gaping wound around you. This is not the triumphant occupation you envisioned. This is limbo, draped in smoke and silence. You send messengers, riders pushing through the hostile landscape, carrying missives to Tsar Alexander I. You dictate terms, offer peace from the heart of the conquered capital, expecting, knowing, that the Tsar, the young man who seemed so pliable at Tilsit, will yield. He must. You hold his sacred city. But silence is the only reply that echoes back across the vast Russian plains. A silence colder and harder than any army. It is not defiance shouted from battlements, but a stony, unnerving refusal to engage, to acknowledge your position, your power, your presence. Each day that passes without a meaningful response is a grain of sand slipping through your fingers. Precious time bleeding away. October arrives, bringing with it the first sharp bite in the wind, the first whisper of the coming winter, the true, implacable enemy you had dismissed. This period in Moscow isn't just a pause in the campaign. It is a critical failure of leadership crystallized. The man who built an empire on decisive action, on seizing the initiative, is now trapped in paralysis. You are waiting for the enemy to conform to your script, to play by your rules. to react as you expect them to. This is the dangerous illusion, believing hope is a strategy. You hoped Alexander would fold. You expected his nerve to break. But reality has diverged violently from your plan, and instead of adapting, changing course, you linger, clinging to a fading assumption like a drowning man to driftwood. It's a profound, almost tragic irony. The military genius, the emperor whose timing was legendary, is now paralyzed by expectation, by a refusal to acknowledge that his opponent possesses a will separate from his own desires. Perhaps it is pride, the inability to conceive that anyone could defy Napoleon, the master of Europe. Perhaps it is wishful thinking, a desperate clinging to the image of Alexander as the weaker player. Whatever the root, this waiting is not strategy. It is surrender by inaction. The insight is stark and unforgiving. Hope is not a strategy, and waiting for the enemy to conform to your desires is a path to ruin. Be prepared to change course when reality diverges from your plan, or reality will change it for you, violently and without mercy. Ask yourself, when have you clung to a failing assumption for too long? Does pride or wishful thinking ever prevent you from seeing and acting on the uncomfortable truth of your situation? The frozen ground is beginning to harden outside. The silence stretches, and the ghosts of the burned city seem to watch, waiting for the inevitable consequence of clinging to hope in the face of a reality that offers none. October 19th, 1812. The air bites with the promise of winter, a chilling prelude to the real enemy. You stand on the edge of Moscow, not as a conqueror surveying your prize, but as a commander overseeing a vast, sorrowful reversal. The Grande Armée, once a glittering torrent of ambition, is now a fractured river of weary souls, choked with carts piled high with plunder that has become an iron weight rather than a trophy. The retreat begins. The plan, tenuous as it was clear. March south, through the untouched lands of Kaluga province, a route offering supply, forage, and a semblance of dignity. It was the lifeline, the alternative route Napoleon had desperately hoped would save this catastrophic venture. But history, like a cruel jester, throws another obstacle. At Maloyaroslavets, Russian resistance solidifies. A brutal, close-quarters fight erupts in the streets of a small town. A clash that achieves little tactically, but everything strategically. It doesn't just halt the southern march, it slams the door shut. The army is forced, by circumstance and the bitter reality of their position, back onto the same devastated road they had scorched on their eager advance toward Moscow. The old Smolensk road. Every step now retraces a path of previous destruction, through villages already plundered, across landscapes stripped bare. This isn't a strategic withdrawal, it's a flight. The confident stride of invaders is replaced by the shuffling gait of survival. A march of ghosts, already haunted by the journey ahead. This forced detour is more than a change of route. It's a stark indictment. It reveals the catastrophic cost of initial miscalculation and delayed action. The decision to linger in Moscow, the failure to secure viable supply lines, the underestimation of Russia's vastness and its cruelest general, Winter, all converge here. The viable escape route, the precious alternative, is denied because the crisis was allowed to fester until options evaporated. You see it clearly. Poor initial planning doesn't just create problems. It drastically shrinks your choices when the inevitable crisis arrives. It forces you onto the worst possible path because all better ones have been burned or blocked by earlier inaction or arrogance. Circumstances, it seems, have an unforgiving way of punishing procrastination and a lack of foresight. The flexibility wasn't built in. The bridges were burned far too early. The unexpected didn't just arrive, it was invited by hubris. Ask yourself, looking at this weary column trudging onto the barren road, are your own plans rigid, burning bridges behind you with every step? Or are you actively building in flexibility, alternative routes, preparing for the certain arrival of the unexpected storm? The ghosts of the Grande Armée offer a chilling answer from the snow-dusted road. Prepare or be broken by the path you are forced to take. November descends like a shroud. You feel the air thin, the sharp bites steal the warmth from your breath. This isn't just weather, it's a physical adversary, solid and unyielding. Winter arrives in Russia, not with a gentle dusting, but with a savage, absolute force. The temperatures plummet, not gradually, but as if God himself has turned down a cosmic thermostat to zero, then plunged it into the negatives. Snow doesn't fall, it assaults, a relentless, blinding white curtain that steals sight and direction. Look at them, the soldiers, the Grand Army, once resplendent, now skeletal figures wrapped in rags. Many still wear the uniforms designed for summer campaigns, a tragic, fatal oversight. You see their faces, gaunt, blue with cold, etched with despair. Frostbite blackens fingers and toes, claiming limbs without a single shot fired. They stumble, fall, and sometimes simply cease moving, freezing solid in the drifts. This is not war fought against men. It is a battle against physics, against the very molecular structure of water, freezing the lifeblood in their veins. And the horses. Thousands, then tens of thousands, collapse. They starve, gnawing on bark and the frozen carcasses of their brethren. Without forage, their strength gives out. Their massive bodies lie sprawled in the snow, monuments to logistical failure and nature's indifference. Each fallen horse is a death knell for the army's mobility. Cannons, the instruments of Napoleon's dominance, stand abandoned, wheels frozen to the ground, their power rendered useless. Supply wagons, carrying the food that means survival, are stranded, their precious cargo unattainable. Starvation becomes rampant. The promised rations vanish. The foraging yields nothing but ice and despair. Soldiers turn on each other, hoarding scraps, committing acts unthinkable months ago. Discipline, the iron spine of Napoleon's military machine, melts away faster than ice in a spring thaw. They are no longer soldiers following orders, but desperate animals driven by the primal need to survive the next agonizing hour. This is the raw, brutal reality where Napoleon's towering ambition, his strategic genius, his sheer force of will, crashes headfirst into an implacable, non-negotiable force, nature itself. There is no negotiation with a blizzard, no treaty with a negative 30-degree wind chill, no clever flanking maneuver against starvation. Here is the piercing, inescapable insight. No amount of human will, power, or meticulous planning can conquer certain fundamental realities of the world. There are limits, absolute and unforgiving, imposed not by armies, but by the universe itself. The Grand Army, built on the back of Napoleon's invincible ego, is undone by something as elemental as the weather. Ask yourself, do you truly understand the external forces and constraints that are fundamentally beyond your control? Humility before the undeniable, immutable realities of the world is not weakness. It is the deepest form of wisdom. Some battles, you learn, cannot be won with courage or strategy. They can only be survived if you are lucky enough to have fate grant you that mercy. The great emperor, who reshaped Europe with a pen and a sword, is shown his absolute powerlessness against the silent, indifferent cold. This is the ultimate tragic irony. The man who controlled everything is utterly controlled by nothingness, by absence of heat, absence of food, absence of hope. Late November bites with a ferocity that strips the breath from your lungs. The plains you once marched across in triumph are now a white, frozen hellscape. Ahead lies the Berezina River, a gray, sluggish barrier in a world bleached of color. Behind, the wolves circle, not just the literal ones in the skeletal forests, but the Cossacks and the converging Russian armies, scenting the kill. Escape funnels here, to this frozen artery. Hope arrives in the form of General Eble and his band of engineers, the Pontoneers. They wade into the icy water waist-deep, their faces grim masks against the cold and the impossible task. These are men of almost mythological resilience, sacrificing themselves to build two fragile bridges from salvaged wood and sheer frozen will. They know they are likely signing their death warrants in the glacial flow, but they work ceaselessly, a defiance against nature and fate. This isn't just duty, it's an elemental, human refusal to surrender completely to the abyss. You join the crush at the riverbank. This isn't the grand army of legend. It's a ragged, starving multitude, soldiers without weapons, officers without commands, thousands of civilian camp followers, women, children, merchants, swept up in the disaster. A desperate, animalistic surge towards the precarious wooden spans. The air is thick with the reek of fear, the screams of dying horses, the near-silent weeping of the defeated. Russian artillery begins to find the range, shells tearing into the packed ranks, sending geysers of ice and flesh into the air. The first bridge groans, sways under the weight, then snaps with a horrifying crack. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, plunge into the freezing water, their cries quickly silenced by the cold current or the pressing weight of others falling on top of them. You see men, women, horses tangled in a drowning mass, the ice near the banks breaking, adding more victims to the river's terrible toll. The scene is one of unimaginable horror, a microcosm of the entire retreat's agony. Courage flickers, soldiers pushing others forward, men sacrificing themselves to hold a plank steady, but it is drowned in the overwhelming panic, the desperate, every man for himself fight for survival. The Berezina becomes more than just a river crossing. It is a symbol, a gauntlet run through death, where the cost of strategic failure is paid in the most brutal human terms. Napoleon himself crossed earlier, securing his own passage, while the bulk of his remaining army faced this inferno. The heroism of the engineers, though stunning, highlights the depth of the disaster it couldn't prevent. It's a tragic irony, surviving months of battle and frostbite, only to perish trying to cross a single river. The insight here is sharp and cold as the Berezina water. Individual bravery, even profound sacrifice, cannot undo fundamental strategic misjudgment. When the system collapses, when the structure of command and logistics dissolves, even the most heroic acts become isolated, insufficient flickers against an overwhelming darkness. What is revealed about human nature, both its capacity for incredible selflessness and its terrifying descent into primal panic, when systems collapse entirely. And in such moments, how do you distinguish necessary sacrifice, like that of the Pontoneers, from the futile, avoidable loss of life caused by strategic blunders and chaotic retreat? The Berezina offers no easy answers, only the chilling reality of the cost. The air bites deeper than any sword. December 5th, 1812, at Smogoni. What remains of the Grande Armée is less an army and more a shuffling, frozen ghost, haunted by the miles of snow and death behind them. You stand among the wreckage, the crushing reality finally brutally clear. This cannot be saved. Not here, not now, not this ruin of a force. He looks at the faces, gaunt, frostbitten, eyes vacant with suffering. He sees the unraveling of his grand design. The retreat from Moscow that became a rout, a massacre by winter and hunger. But the emperor's gaze sweeps past the immediate horror towards a distant horizon, Paris. The empire is wounded, bleeding power and prestige, but it is not yet dead. And he is the heart, the brain, the indispensable force that can pump new life into it. The decision crystallizes, cold and sharp as the ice. He must go, now, leaving the tattered survivors under the command of Joachim Murat, his flamboyant, often reckless cavalryman. It's a gamble. Murat, while brave on a horse, lacks the strategic depth and authority to salvage this. But the real battle is no longer in these frozen fields. It's in the chancelleries of Europe, in the salons of Paris, where plots brew, and most importantly, in the conscription offices where a new generation of soldiers must be found. You watch as he prepares. A simple sleigh, a handful of loyal companions. Berthier, Caulaincourt, Duroc. The contrast is stark, almost cruelly so. The hundreds of thousands left behind face an agonizingly slow march of death, collapsing into drifts, starved, frozen, harried by Cossacks. Napoleon's small party begins a lightning-fast clandestine dash covering over 1,500 miles in just 13 days. While the remnants of his glory freeze in Poland, he is halfway to Fontainebleau, planning the next campaign. This swift exit is presented as strategic necessity. A leader must be where he can do the most good, where he can rebuild, where he can win the next phase. Staying here would mean shared doom, pointless solidarity among the dying. Going means survival for the empire, potential for future victory. Yet the image of the emperor abandoning his suffering troops, huddled against the cold in a warm sleigh while they perish in droves, is searing. It is the ultimate calculation, the many versus the future potential led by the one. Here lies the chilling paradox of leadership in extremis. Is this the ruthless pragmatism required to preserve the mission? Or is it the point where self-preservation crosses the unforgivable line into abandonment? The soldiers who marched and died for him believed in his star, in his commitment. To leave them was, for many, a profound betrayal. This wasn't just a retreat. It was a stripping away of the mystique, a moment when the emperor became, for a bitter many, just a man who saved his own skin. Consider the weight of that decision. Standing in his frozen boots, seeing absolute ruin around you, but knowing your presence elsewhere could raise a new army, potentially save the state. What is the moral calculus? At what point does the greater good of the entity, the empire, outweigh the immediate suffering of the individuals who constitute it? He speeds towards Paris, leaving behind the wreck of his ambition, not to mourn, but to scheme, to gather strength, to ensure the narrative of the disaster doesn't shatter his power base before he can rally. The sleigh bells fade into the blizzard, carrying the man who represents the hope of millions, but leaving behind the cold, hard proof that some costs are paid in blood and ice, not by the leader, but by the lead. Days bleed into weeks as you race back across frozen lands, leaving the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée to their terrible fate. You arrive in Paris, the city a stark contrast to the desolate plains you just fled. Initially, the official bulletins, carefully crafted by loyal ministers, speak of mere exaggerated losses, of a strategic retreat necessitated by the harsh winter. They paint a picture of misfortune, not annihilation. The propaganda machine whirs, attempting to spin the catastrophe into a mere setback, a trial overcome by the emperor's resilience. But the truth, a monstrous, icy specter, cannot be kept confined within official pronouncements. It arrives in ragged pieces, carried by the few skeletal figures who straggle back through the snow-dusted roads. The survivors, bearing witness to horrors words cannot fully capture. These aren't soldiers returning from a tough campaign. They are ghosts from a frozen hell. Their gaunt faces, their frost-bitten limbs, their whispered accounts of cannibalism, freezing to death by the thousands, and the utter disintegration of discipline and hope. This is the undeniable evidence. Each survivor is a living indictment, a walking, breathing refutation of the carefully constructed lies. The horrifying reality seeps into the drawing rooms of Paris, the barracks, the markets. It spreads like a fatal illness. 2/3 of the million men, the finest fighting force Europe had ever seen, your instrument of dominance, simply vanished. Horses, artillery, supplies, all gone. The scale of the catastrophe is incomprehensible, a void where an army once stood. This isn't a defeat, it is an extinction event for the Grande Armée. Suddenly, irrevocably, the myth begins to crack. The aura of invincibility that has shielded you, that has cowed kings and inspired millions, shatters like ice under a heavy blow. For years, you have been the man who could not lose, the strategist whose will bent reality. Now, reality has delivered a crushing blow that even your strategic genius could not avert, and your iron will could not overcome. The great gamble in Russia exposed not just your strategic limits, but the limits of sheer human endurance and logistical capacity against the unforgiving elements. Europe feels the tremor. Enemies, once trembling in your shadow, lift their heads, seeing not an unstoppable force, but a weakened giant bleeding from a self-inflicted wound. Allies, bound by fear or opportunism, waver, reconsidering their allegiances as the balance of power shifts violently. This is the unavoidable moment of accountability. Catastrophic failure, no matter how skillfully obscured initially, has a brutal way of revealing itself, shattering reputations built over decades and fundamentally altering the power landscape. The facade of invincibility, so meticulously built, crumbles under the weight of irrefutable, devastating truth. Ask yourself, can true authority be maintained once the reality of a leader's limits and failures becomes undeniably, tragically clear? What happens to the carefully constructed myth when faced with the irrefutable, devastating truth of absolute collapse. This isn't just a military defeat. It's the beginning of the end of an era defined by your singular will. You have marched with Napoleon to the edge of the world and back through hell. You have seen the intoxicating heights of ambition and the crushing depths of its failure when unchecked. Now, stand with him at the frozen precipice of ruin. The invasion of Russia was not merely a military campaign. It was a profound, tragic drama illustrating a timeless, brutal principle. Greatness demands not only boundless ambition, the fire to reach for the impossible, but also acute self-awareness, the cold wisdom to recognize limits, and the humility to yield to reality. Napoleon, at the breathtaking peak of his power, utterly forgot this. He stood astride Europe, his will seemingly bending nations and nature alike, and he came to believe his will alone could conquer distance, climate, and the sheer, grinding limits of human endurance. You are there, seeing the warnings mount, the logistical nightmares, the dwindling supplies, the vast, indifferent emptiness stretching before the Grande Armée. He sees these warnings not as critical data points requiring adaptation, but as challenges to his own supreme ego, obstacles to be bulldozed by sheer force of will. He pushes past the point of peak potential, where victory was still achievable, into the realm of impossible overreach. The snows of Russia, the biting winds, the endless plains populated by a retreating, burning enemy, these did not defeat him as much as his own inability to stop did. The campaign becomes a mirror, reflecting not just military miscalculation, but a fundamental human flaw: the blinding nature of absolute ambition when unanchored by reality. You watch this story, etched forever in the ice and blood of the East, serves as a chilling mirror for anyone who seeks power, influence, or greatness. What if history repeats itself? You look at the modern world. What if today's leaders, driven by grand visions and insulated by past successes, ignore the logistical realities of complex ventures, dismiss the wisdom of caution offered by experts, and push their ambitions past the breaking point? The scale changes, the technology differs, but the core human flaw, the refusal to see the world as it truly is when blinded by belief in one's own invincibility, remains constant. The consequences are horrifyingly predictable: isolation, collapse, the chilling judgment of history. Napoleon himself, reflecting years later in the desolate exile of St. Helena, perhaps glimpsed this truth through the fog of self-justification. He once wrote, not long before the end, "Circumstances. I am the creature of circumstance." A moment of almost tragic irony from the man who bent circumstances to his will for so long. But this is only half the truth. He was also the creator of his most fatal circumstances, born from an ambition that knew how to conquer the world, but never how to govern itself, to restrain itself. Remember the dust of the Niemen crossing, the fire of Moscow rising against an empty triumph, the horrifying, icy chaos of the Berezina crossing. Remember the terrible price of absolute belief in one's own invincibility, paid in the lives of 500,000 men and the shattering of an empire. The greatest empires, both personal and political, crumble not just from external force, but from the internal rot of unchecked ego and a fundamental refusal to see the world and oneself as it truly is. The echoes of that frozen retreat fade, leaving behind not just the sorrow of loss, but the sharp, undeniable lesson. You've journeyed with Napoleon from the sun-drenched fields of Italy to the icy plains of Russia, witnessing the dizzying ascent and the catastrophic fall. If there is one overarching wisdom to be gleaned from this epic life, it lies not just in the stratagems he deployed, but in the fundamental human equation of ambition meeting reality. Napoleon's final grandest gamble illustrates this truth with brutal clarity. The ultimate boundary to human power isn't always the enemy army or the political opposition. It is often found within the limits of one's own judgment, the capacity for self-deception, the inability to say enough. Studying history honestly, without the glaze of hero worship or simple condemnation, offers us this invaluable mirror. It shows us not just the deeds of great figures, but the timeless patterns of human behavior, the recurring pitfalls of power and ambition. We learn that true strength isn't just about pushing forward relentlessly. It's also about knowing when to pivot, when to consolidate, when to recognize the undeniable truth of a situation, even when it shatters a grand vision. Napoleon taught the world how to conquer, but his downfall in Russia taught history a deeper, more enduring lesson about the quiet, devastating power of self-awareness and the crushing weight of unchecked ego. In the end, it wasn't the battlefield that defeated him. It was believing he couldn't lose.